Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Well, it seems to me that everybody has something to talk about when it comes to the big crash there on Wall Street and the big $700 billion+ bailout. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and we're going to be exploring the Federal Reserve System and find out something that you might find very, very interesting. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is its author, Edward Griffin, and he's going to be talking with us today about The Creature from Jekyll Island and the Federal Reserve System. And I'd like to welcome here to the program Edward Griffin, and thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today, Mr. Griffin.
Well, thanks, Daniel, for inviting me.
Now, it's kind of interesting because it seems lately that I'm coming across more and more information about just our whole monetary system, and it seems that what I'm discovering makes a lot more sense than the way we've been doing things. Now, let's talk about what you discovered as you were doing the research that helped you to create the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Oh, sure, Daniel. My interest in the Federal Reserve System goes back quite a few years. I would say even back into the 1960s, because in those days I was producing a series of documentary video programs, and I wanted to do a program on the nature and the cause of inflation. And at that time I knew nothing about the Federal Reserve, but anybody inquiring into the mechanism of inflation has to come across the Federal Reserve, because that is the engine of inflation. So I started to take an interest in it in those days. And I never did finish the documentary, by the way, but that was the beginning of the genesis of a long period of investigation. Finally, I produced the book, as you probably know, back in 1990. So it's just a growing interest on my part. But the thing that kept me with it was the fact that this was not just an academic study. This was not just about learning how the money comes into existence and how it goes out of existence. It wasn't just about the terminology they use to create credits and debits and their deposits and obligations and so forth. All of that is kind of boring, actually. Mm-hmm. What I discovered was that there was a crime here. This was a crime of huge proportions. It was theft. It involved stealing of the purchasing power, the wealth of the American people. It was a silent and almost an invisible theft process that was going on, in which money was being extracted from the middle class primarily, very quietly being moved up to those who were in the financial industry and those who had, political connections. And then I discovered, too, that much of this was created from the very beginning. It isn't something that just happened. It isn't something that just, drifted into that because of corruption, as you might expect might be the case. But this was planned right from the very beginning, and then I discovered that it was not only planned from the beginning, but it was planned in secrecy from the beginning. Uh-huh. And all of those things, compounded on top of each other until finally I was really hooked. So what I saw there, Daniel, was not a dry textbook on banking and monetary theory, but a whodunit, like a detective story. Mm-hmm. And that's really how I unfolded the story, and that's what still holds my interest today. It is a whodunit. We know who did it. We know how they did it. We know where the bodies are buried, and we know what the motive is. And now all the victims, the secondary victims, and the families, and that's the American people. Only today are they beginning to realize, oh my gosh, they've been robbed, they've been lied to, they've been cheated. And now, a little late in the game, but nevertheless, it's not too late. People are beginning to wake up and ask questions.
Now, it's quite interesting when you take a look at, for instance, this presidential election, and here we're cruising along, and the candidates are basically, vying for why they feel they would be the best person to represent the country. And then all of a sudden, there's the big bailout. And I thought, now, this is kind of interesting because they made it seem like it all happened at once. And I found that kind of alarming because I figured to get that far into debt, it doesn't take just an overnight situation. That's something, especially of that magnitude, that took some time. So based on the Jekyll Island and the Federal Reserve and what you've researched, how do you view something like that?
Well, I think you nailed it right on the head there, that it took a long time to develop. In fact, the process started right at the very inception of the Federal Reserve back in 1913.
Mm-hmm.
The Federal Reserve, perhaps we should define it a little more clearly, and then we'll explain how they do this sort of thing. First of all, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency like many people think. That's what I thought when I started into the process, but it's not. The Federal Reserve is a hybrid. It looks like a government agency because it has the power of government to enforce its rules. If you don't do what the Federal Reserve says, you can go to prison. And so therefore you think, well, that must be a government agency, but it's not. It's been given it's been given the ability to put people into jail if you don't follow the rules of the Federal Reserve. But itself, it is a private corporation that was created by Congress and given that monopolistic power over the. Really, when you look at it, it is a cartel. The Federal Reserve, let me repeat that, is a cartel. It's no different than a banana cartel, an oil cartel, sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel made up of the largest, most powerful banking institutions in America. Formed an agreement to force all banking institutions, savings and loan institutions, and now recently that's been expanded to all institutions involving the exchange of money, to require them to not compete with each other. It's a anti-competitive agreement to make sure that everybody's in line, nobody does anything differently than anybody else, and it's sold to the people as being a means of protecting the people, stabilizing the economy and that nonsense. Otherwise, people wouldn't go for it. But in reality, it's just a cartel agreement to make sure that there are no serious competitors in the field and gradually to consolidate it all into the hands of one, two, or maybe three very large institutions somewhere down the line. So that's what it really is. And so when the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Mr. Bernanke, or whoever happens to be the guy at the moment, testifies before Congress, and he says, well, we lowered the interest rates today. We did this because of you folks. We did this because we were worried about the economy and the impact it has on the common American. So we did this for you folks. And, of course, everybody thinks that's wonderful, but if he really said the truth, he would say, we're doing this for our folks. We're doing this because, remember, everybody, we're a cartel. And cartels always do those things which are best for the members of the cartel, first and foremost. But if they said that, of course, that wouldn't go over too well with the voters. So they always mask it in terms of doing it for the economy or for the American people.
Yeah,
anyway,
like I said, it was
back,
just.
Go ahead. I lost your track there. The main issue is how could this have built over so many years and suddenly spring forth? Well, it's because the cartel has always been promoting its own interests first. It's been expanding the money supply, creating money out of nothing because they can lend that money at interest, which means when you go into the bank and you walk out with a $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 loan or maybe a $300,000 loan on your house or something like that, you must remember that that money did not exist before you walked into the bank. They created it on the books. It's a bookkeeping entry. And then, so you've got money that didn't exist prior to that, but you pay interest on that loan, which means that the institutions that are in this cartel are able to collect interest on nothing, which isn't too scabby,
It's like being out there and selling lemonade, only you don't have a cup or you don't have the lemonade, and then you expect somebody to pay for it.
Yeah, you just say it wasn't that good.
It's interesting, Mr. Griffin, when we talk about this, because here a lot of people are trying to, there's another edge to this too, and that's credit. And you have these private institutions that were set up. There's 3 of them. There could be another one that basically determine whether you're credit worthy. And so these people are out busting their tails, trying to be sure that they're good citizens with clear credit so they can go out and buy the American dream, which is the home and then the nice car and the like. But then, you're saying the Federal Reserve, through these institutions, are creating money out of thin air. They're getting you to be these good citizens so that you're worthy of this credit. In other words, worthy of getting nothing. They put out nothing, but yet they gain everything. And you think to yourself, if more people knew about this, what then would happen?
Well, I think if more people knew about this, they would demand political reform. They would demand the abolition of the Federal Reserve System. They would demand honesty in banking. they would ask their government to stay out of the business except to make sure that that everyone honors their contracts.
Mm-hmm.
That really is the proper function of government, in my view, is not to provide anything for anybody, but simply to make sure that people in the market do what they say they're going to do. Mm-hmm. Right now, if the banks fail, if they make bad investment decisions, they take your money on deposit and then they create more money on top of that. And then if it turns out to be a bad decision they made a bad loan, instead of having their stockholders pay the consequences like any other business would do, or possibly going out of business and failing like any other business would do, no, they go to their partners in government and say, oh, hey, we just made a bad deal over here, so send us some tax money, please, so we can get back into business.
Right.
So they have a unique position. They have favoritism because they're political partners with the politicians. So I think what the ideal situation is to break that bond, to have a separation of state and let banks rise or fall like any other business strictly on the basis of their merit and their got the business profitably.
Now let's talk about Jekyll Island itself and where this all began, because that's quite interesting. You'd think this would be some sort of a mythical place just by its name alone, but this is in fact a real place.
Oh yeah, very real place. You can visit it. It's off the coast of Georgia, and it's quite an interesting place to visit. Back in the days when the Federal Reserve System was created on that island, it was back then, the only way to get to it was by a ferry boat across the inland strait from, I think it's Brunswick. But today you can take a little bridge over there, and the state of Georgia has since purchased the island and made it into some kind of a little resort community. Over there, you can see the mansions. They've been preserved or restored. The mansions that these super wealthy people lived in for their winter homes. Also, the big clubhouse is still standing, very well preserved. The clubhouse was the center of the social activities of these super wealthy people. And it's in that clubhouse that the Federal Reserve System was actually created in 19. An interesting story because in November of that year, a small group of financial moguls, I guess you'd call them, the heads of the largest banking firms, got on board and a couple of politicians, they got on board the private railroad car that belonged to Nelson Aldrich, and that was in New Jersey. And then they traveled for 2 nights and a day in about a journey down to Brunswick, Georgia, and then over the ferry boat over to the island, Jekyll Island, and to the clubhouse. Because in those days, the island was privately owned, the whole island. It was called the Jekyll Island Club, and it was billionaires in New York like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates. And so they went there to be out of the view of public scrutiny. They certainly didn't want to go to Washington, D.C., and they quietly drafted the Federal Reserve System in the clubhouse there at Jekyll Island. And they denied it for quite a few years there afterwards. They made sure nobody knew they went to that meeting, and then after they came back, they denied that they had ever been there. They said, oh, no, that's just a conspiracy theory of some kind. No, we never went. Later on, they said, oh, yeah, we went, but we just went there to do some duck hunting, And finally, after
they certainly hunted a lot of ducks over the years, didn't they?
Yeah, they got a lot of ducks. But then finally, they began to brag about it after the Federal Reserve was enacted into law eventually and became revered by the American people as a great institution and for their interest. And then they began to say, yep, yeah, we're the ones that did it all right. And they started patting themselves on the back, and some of them wrote books about it, and others gave interviews to newspaper reporters, and biographers of these people picked up the information. And now you can go to any well-stocked library, and you can get original documents that point right to these men, and learn in great detail what they did there, what they discussed, and why. Yeah, it's a very interesting origin. And the fact that they went to that island, and the fact that they had great secrecy surrounding this meeting, is significant, because you might say, well, why shouldn't people, even bankers, go any place they wish and and draft what they think is a good idea for a banking law? And the answer is very clear. The law, the Federal Reserve Act, this new banking law that was sold to the American people as a means of breaking the grip of the money trust. That's the phrase they used in those days. People were concerned about the concentration of financial power into the hands of, very powerful firms in Wall Street. And so they wanted a law to break that up and put the control in the hands of the people through their elected representatives, the usual.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it was sold to the American people, as a bill to break the grip of the money trust. Well, as it turns out, the bill was written by the money trust. And so if that fact had been known, that these guys who were the money trust, the heads of the largest banks and investment firms in Wall Street, if it had been known that the very people who were supposed to be controlled by this bill were the ones who wrote the bill, boy, it might have set off a few alarms,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why they had to keep the whole thing very, very secret.
Mr. Griffin, I was just thinking about this recent bailout that everybody has really grumbled about, and I find it interesting that Congress just decides we're going to go ahead and do this and we're going to vote it in. This is just a few individuals, and we're going to do this, and it's going to be at the stake of the taxpayer as we're told. So I think to myself, if it's something that big where it's the taxpayer who's putting out their money, why didn't then they put that to a national vote? It really seems interesting. It's just like the war that we went to in Iraq, George Bush just decides, I'm going to ask you for $200 billion. I don't care what you tell me. I'm going to take it anyway. And you think to yourself then, where is the true value of the monetary system altogether?
Well, there are two important issues there, and the first one I'd like to comment on, and you're so right. We do not have,
I'm getting lucky.
we do not have representative government anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We labor under the myth of that. We used to have a constitutional republic of limited government, where the people were the source of the power and the government was the servant. Year by year, since literally from the very first year of the founding of the great country, that has begun to change. People who went into government began to nibble away at that because they didn't want those restrictions on their. The American people became very complacent because it was a wonderful place to live. There was a lot of prosperity, a lot of freedom, and they didn't really care too much about what was going on in Washington. And they kind of lost interest in politics in general. And so over the years, that balance has changed. And so now we have the situation where government is on top. People are the servants of the government. And even though we still read in our textbooks that we elect representatives and we determine what goes on, it just is not so. And anybody that observes what's going on in Washington can see that fact every day. And the issue you just brought up, the issue that almost all of the American people were against a bailout program, taking tax dollars and saving these investment companies that had made bad loan decisions. Everybody was against it, and yet the politicians just almost unanimously voted for it. It's just like when the American people were against giving away the Panama Canal. It didn't make any difference. The ruling elite wanted to give away the Panama Canal for international reasons. And, over and over again, you can go into the record of Congress and see how votes almost always are completely without regard to the will of the people. So that tells us something very important and something very tragic, and it should alarm people. Unfortunately, the people in my neighborhood don't seem to care.
Yeah, either that or they're trying to get their televisions converted to digital.
Well, that's it, and that's why they don't care about these little issues about their freedom. They're more interested about digital television. And so it's a sad commentary on the political aptitude, I guess, of the American people. Well, that was the one issue, and I've forgotten now. There were two issues. One was the loss of representative government, and then you raised another very important issue in that question.
Well, yeah, it was the idea that, well, if they're just going to go ahead and do what they want, how then do we change that?
Yes,
right.
Of course. Well, the only way we can change that is a two-step process. the American people have to get defocused from their digital televisions and get refocused back on the principles of freedom and limited government so that we have a consensus in this country. That's the first step. And then the second step is to convert that consensus into political reform, which, put very bluntly, means that most of those nameplates in Washington have got to be replaced. It's very simple in concept, but not easy, because people just aren't interested in these issues, and they're too inclined to accept the views and opinions of the talking heads on, national television and radio.
Well, what's interesting about this election here is that this is from general conversation that I was picking up or involved with people is they were recognizing those things that over the years that were working that no longer work. For instance, the way, say, the Republican Party always seemed to have an air of fear hanging over you, so it was almost as though they created the fear, so if you'll allow us to do this, then you won't have to worry about that anymore. Oh, okay, well, if you say that I don't need to be afraid of that anymore, then you're taking care of it, I'm fine with that. And then the next thing is they take a look at mainstream media and how they're misreporting so much. It's like people are becoming aware of this now, but I think it seems so huge that I don't believe a lot of people understand where do we get started. And obviously the first thing is don't worry about converting and upgrade your television to HD. That's not that big of a deal, but it's like, where do you get started? Does this start by household, by community, by area? Where do you get started, I guess?
Well, I believe there's no other place to start except by household and community, family, And it's sometimes reaching your own family is the hardest step of all, because your family knows you too well. They can't imagine, knowing all the mistakes that you have made in your life, they can't imagine that you would.
Right.
But once you get up beyond your family, a lot of people are open to this, and if you've done your research and you know your facts, it's economy. Now, once you get past that into the deeper issues of what is the proper function of government, philosophical or ideological issues, that gets pretty hard because most of us have been brought up in government schools and taught the necessity of collectivism. We've been taught that government is really the ideal solution for most problems. And, the bigger the problem, the more obvious it is, we've been told, that government is the only solution to solve it. So the idea of individual action and freedom of choice is just beyond the comprehension of many of us. And unless we change that, I don't think there's any hope. I think we're just going to live in a system of collectivism as we now are, and that collectivism is like pregnancy. It grows. It never stops at a half point, Collectivism, every year we have more and more laws, thousands of more laws, and our freedom goes down, the size and power of government goes up. And if you chart it on a piece of paper, you can see it's almost a straight line, the power of government going up, up, up every year. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to project that line to see that in the very near future, that line will reach the top, which means totalitarianism. We are moving into totalitarianism, and we don't even know what to call it, but it's called collectivism, and it's this concept that government is the only solution for all problems.
I keep looking back at the election, and you look at the McCain campaign constantly pointing fingers at Barack Obama. Oh, he's a socialist, and by the last week or so, he turned into a communist. Well, what do you guys think you are?
They're
you're all part of the same system.
Yeah, so. There's the left and the right, and I believe that the left wing and the right wing are just two wings of the same ugly bird, and the bird is collectivism.
Yeah.
So you've got the communist model on one side and the Nazi model on the other. Yeah, who are you going to vote for?
So what do you think about our new president now? I mean, is there a possibility through all this inspiration that people seem to be feeling or experiencing that maybe we can change direction? I mean, because this is one of those rare times really in the history where people seen that their vote actually mattered. And I think that's probably part of the apathy over many years, is that people would be involved in the process, but then the outcome, at least it seemed for mainstream in many areas, depending on whether it was a law or an amendment to a law or an actual public servant that was elected into office, that just didn't go their way. And then you take a look at, for instance, 2000, which seemed to be one of the biggest scams possibly that there was in electing a president, where it was alleged that the Bush administration just stole the votes out of Florida. And so people seeing the fact that, well, my vote didn't matter, they just went in, created a fiasco, and all of a sudden somebody that we really didn't want in office is now in office. And you take a look at things like 9/11 and you say, well, was this something that actually happened because of terrorism, or was it a possible created terrorism so he could continue in office? And so the apathy just kind of waned down on people, and now we're in this new time where Barack Obama is now President of the United States, and people felt and feel that their vote mattered, that their voice was heard.
Well, I think the active word there is that they do feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
But now the question is, did it really make any difference? And I know everybody is euphoric about the possibility of substantial change. They're not going to like what I'm going to say. And so I'll probably bring down a lot of wrath on my head. But I do know that in my view, let's rephrase this. In my view, the most important issues of the day weren't even mentioned in the election. The most important issue, can you think of anything more important than the loss of America, the abolition of America, the merging of it with Canada and Mexico into a regional unit, the North American Union? I can't imagine anything more significant than the elimination of the United States. And both candidates are for that. And they never even mentioned it in the debate. It wasn't allowed to be discussed. The sovereignty issue. Another element of sovereignty is the money, the Federal Reserve System. That it's the most corrupt institution you could possibly imagine. It's been given the monopolistic power to create and extinguish the nation's money supply. It has bankrupted the nation, and that process is going to continue. And neither candidate would even touch the issue because they're both beholden to it. So I could go down the list. The most important issues of all, neither candidate would even discuss because they're not going to change anything. They're both in agreement. They're in lockstep to the big issues, in my view, that are destroying America. So the debates really were on lesser issues. They were about race. They were about style and who won the debate, who was the sharpest, who looked the best, how did he do in the debate. It never crossed anybody's mind to think about the issues. Issues were always, well, are we going to stay in Iraq? Are we going to invade Iran, or should we, or shouldn't we, and when, and so forth? But nothing was ever meaningful about it. That they both agreed we're going to stay over in the Middle East forever. You know, the real issues were not contested between either candidate. And so just because one of the candidates very cleverly used the word change as the slogan for the campaign doesn't mean that anything really is going to change, except it will now be a bunch of left-wingers instead of a bunch of right-wingers promoting the expansion of government.
Right. It just seems so daunting, and it seems that we hope that there's a possibility to turn this around, but there has to be a point that this all has to either implode or explode on itself, isn't there?
Well, I believe, a moment ago I mentioned that straight line. If you just follow it to the top, it reaches totalitarianism, and I think that's I guess that's the implosion at that point. The process will continue, unfortunately, now with a new president, because he's not talking about reducing government or getting rid of the Federal Reserve System or preserving our sovereignty. He's not for those things at all. So the process will continue, and that's where it reached the end of the line when government runs everything. They run the free market. There's no free market anymore. The stock market is pretty well fixed. Even the price of gold and silver is rigged by the government. The cost of that is all being paid for by the taxpayer. I just ran across an interesting thing to illustrate that point. Our organization, we have a little organization called Freedom Force International, And every year we produce a silver medallion with our name on it and some symbols, which we like to think is a little textbook on the principles of freedom, and we call it the Libertatum. And we're coming up toward the end of the year, and I thought, well, I'll contact the mint that produces this for us and buy a big block of silver so that we can start production and have our 2009 Libertatums ready. Mm-hmm. And so I asked for a quotation. Well, as you know, in the market, I don't know what it is today, but as of yesterday, silver was quoted the spot price of somewhere around, $9, $9.40 or something like that per ounce. So I asked the mint, I said, can you get silver? They said, yes. I said, well, then please give me a quote on how much it'll cost to produce these Libertatums. And the price came back over $10. Over $20. $20. In other words, 100% jump over the spot price. And I said, how is this possible? They said, well, the spot price is theoretical. It's paper. In other words, you can buy it for that. You can send money off and say, I want to buy silver at this price, and they'll send you a piece of paper that says you bought it. But you can't get delivery on it.
Mm-hmm. It's just like the oil price. I've been astounded that this summer, I think it was as late as August, gas was almost $5 a gallon, and now it's less than half of that now in just a couple of months. And I'm thinking, I have never seen gas rise and fall at these significant levels like I have in this period of a couple of months. And I say to myself, if people could pay attention to the fact that somehow something about what they felt or maybe the oil companies had heard changed the way they were doing business, which caused these prices to drop, they would realize these large, enormous institutions, whether it's Wall Street's, whether it's the banking industry, whether it's government, that if you just literally walk away, you no longer use or render those services, there's really not a whole lot they can do, so they're forced to change to get your business back. And it gets simple. It can be almost as simple as, growing your own food in the garden so you don't go to the grocery store anymore. Yeah. Really pulling away, because really what it all comes down to is that we need to all eat, we all need to be able to breathe, and we all need to be able to live, but it seems that we've surrendered a lot of these things that we used to do for ourselves over, as you said, to someone else to do it for us. And if people could just wake up to that, they'd realize all these big corporations and whatnot just don't have the power that people believe they do.
Yeah, that's right. And that's assuming, of course, that we have a modicum of freedom to make that choice.
Right.
At the end of that line, when totalitarianism is finally upon us, then we won't even have that choice. There are countries in the communist world today where you cannot grow your own food. It's against the law. And even in our own history, there was a time when people who own gold were forced by law to surrender it. That could happen again. That's what governments always do. When the people start escaping in one way or another from their control, they just pass laws that make it illegal for you to do that. So we've got to turn this around before it reaches that point. Otherwise, I'm afraid our children and our grandchildren have got some pretty bleak days ahead.
Either that, or we're all just going to become one giant government body and trying to decide, well, which one's the senator this time, who's the local legislature, and nobody will be manufacturing cars or doing anything else anymore.
Well, that's kind of the goal. I think the collectivist model really is the military model, where you come in at the bottom and you move up through the ranks depending upon a lot of performance to some extent, but largely your social connections and your buddy club too. And then there are lieutenants and colonels and generals, and have a uniform, and you know what your rank is, and you have a set pay, and that's it, brother. And you salute your superiors. I think that's kind of the beehive social structure that a lot of people really want in this world.
I know it's interesting. Years ago that I talked with author Daniel Quinn, who wrote Ishmael, and his book that we talked about at the time was called Beyond Civilization. And he was talking about the major great civilizations, whether it was the Roman Empire, the Mayan civilization, the Egyptians, and these were all great powers, and he realized there was something interesting because they were hierarchical societies that it just seemed that once they got to a particular level, that was about as good as it got, and then it was almost as though the civilization just disappeared. It was as though the people on the bottom, as you're talking about, just simply walked away, and there wasn't much that the people at the top could do about it. And this seems to be a continuation of that phenomenon.
Yeah, I think there's a definite trend there. That's true.
Yeah.
And however, I don't want to always be the sound of doom and negativism, but also we must remember that today there are means of controlling the minds of the population that the Egyptians didn't have, and the Mayans didn't have. And relatively new science of mind control developed about 100 years ago and still under development. Today, you can get people to do the most absurd things on their own without forcing them, simply by making it seem cool. You know?
Yeah, isn't that true?
I mean, look what some of the young people are doing to their bodies, and where they're putting these little rings and they're tattooing their bodies. Because it's why? Because it's cool.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and yet, a few years ago, you couldn't tie these kids down and make them do that. They would have fought for their lives.
Yeah, the sense of ritual has certainly become cliche, hasn't it?
Yeah, and this carries over into politics as well.
Uh-huh. There's really a lot to explore here, and I'm not one who tends to be conspiratorial by any way, and certainly with the information that I've discovered that you have put together here, it's far from that. You really have laid down a very solid argument for why people need to become aware of what has happened in our country, and simply arming an individual with the right information, as you were saying, will help for others to say, for some reason that makes a lot of sense, and I'm just not going to tolerate this anymore. Do you see the possibility of a movement in that direction?
Well, yes. In fact, it's already started, Daniel, and maybe that's something I should head toward to close this off, because I saw the need for that quite a while ago, and back in 2002, we actually created an organization to bring that about. And maybe organization isn't quite the right word. Let's call it a network. But it's called Freedom Force International. And as the name suggests, it is international in scope because this problem of the growth of government and the loss of personal freedom is going on everywhere in the world. And so we now, as a matter of fact, have members in 51 countries.
Wow.
And and it's amazing to see how this is growing quite rapidly. People have come together realizing that it's not enough just to be informed, and it's certainly not enough just to complain about it. What are you going to do about it? And we operate under the simple principle that unless you have power, you can't do anything about it. The reason that collectivists are ruling us is because they hold the levers of power. They're in government. They're in charge of the media. They run the school systems, So those are power centers of society, and almost every one of them is in the hands of people who like big government and collectivists. And so we decided that instead of complaining about that, we must find ways and means to recapture control of the power centers of society. And only in that fashion will we ever be able to make a difference. So that is our mission. And anybody that really wants to get involved and make a difference in the world, is serious about this, I urge them to come to our website and spend some time, splash around the site, see what we believe in, what our tactics and strategies are, and then come on in and join forces with us. So the website is freedomforceinternational.org. ORG stands for organization. All one word, freedomforceinternational.org.
And our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin. Now, I just wonder, what then does a world look like in that scenario?
A good question. I've been one of the things I want to do before I cross the Rainbow Bridge.
Just to realize there's two ends of a rainbow, and we've missed the rainbow altogether.
I know what this side is like. But I've always wanted to write the utopian novel. It's never been written to my satisfaction anyway. Plenty of socialist or collectivist utopian novels. They were very popular back in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s. Everybody was writing a novel about how wonderful it would be under total government regimentation, and there would be no wars and no hunger and no greed, all of this theory. that comes along with Marxism, and but nobody ever wrote a novel of what it would be like if government were properly restricted to its three legitimate functions. In Freedom Force International, we believe that the proper function of government is to protect and not to provide, nothing more, to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the three functions: to protect our lives, our liberty, and property, nothing more. What would life be like if our government was truly, instead of a government, we wouldn't even call it a government, we would call it a protectorate.
Mm-hmm.
That word alone explains it all. What would it be like living in a true protectorate? I think it would be wonderful. I think there'd be more peace, there'd be more happiness, there'd be more prosperity, there'd certainly be a lot more freedom
mm-hmm.
than we have now. I think crime would be almost non-existent, and there would be a wide diversity of culture and ideas, different lifestyles, of course. We may not like all the lifestyles that somebody else would choose, but that's none of our business.
Right.
You know? And as long as it doesn't affect my life, my liberty, or my property, I think people should be allowed to do whatever they want to do. So otherwise, I won't be allowed to do whatever I want to do,
mm-hmm.
as long as I don't infringe on their right to life, liberty, or property. I think it'd be a wonderful life, Daniel, and a wonderful
mm-hmm.
world. Maybe I'll write that book someday.
Hopefully. I know it's interesting you bring up about the ideal of the government really should be in place to protect our freedom, so to speak. And there was a book a couple of years ago I read that was called The Sovereign Individual, and it was about the idea of the possibility that maybe that especially in this time that big government will decline because of the internet, the idea of how we can get and send information. Locale is no longer an issue anymore. And what was interesting is he's started with the history of, for instance, the Agrarian Age and how government came to be was exactly that, was about protecting the big businesses, because back in the day, for instance, in the industrial period, excuse me, you had large companies, and so the government would make sure that they could prosper without anybody else infringing on what they were doing, and so they were able to collect taxes, and that's how they began to grow. But now you take a look at this day and age, there's no more jurisdiction, so to speak. Businesses, large companies can be ran out of somebody's home, for instance. So now the government gets to a position where it gets more and more difficult to be able to grab a hold of something to protect. So their contention in this particular book is that there's the possibility that the government will have to streamline and actually be effective, or it just won't be in existence at all. Merge this with the topic, for instance, with your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and you can see where it's not about conspiracy, it's just a lot of common sense.
Well, yeah, this isn't conspiracy. There's nothing that I wrote about in The Creature from Jekyll Island that
mm-hmm.
involves a true conspiracy. Now, there's no question that they did a lot of things in secret.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want the gum-chewing public to know what they were doing, but that doesn't by itself make it a conspiracy. They just, a lot of things are done quietly. Mm-hmm. Corporations keep their secrets. That doesn't make them guilty of a conspiracy.
Sure.
Governments have secrets, doesn't make them guilty of a conspiracy. So this is not a conspiracy in the classic sense of the word, but boy, there are a lot of things that are going on that these people don't want you and me to know about, and that's simply a fact. Mm-hmm. And as far as the internet being an effective break against the growth of government, I like that idea, but don't ever underestimate these totalitarians. They never give up.
Yeah, that's true.
And so now we see this the internet, which theoretically could have been a force for great dissemination of ideas and counter forces. Now, what are the totalitarians doing? They're taking over the internet because they don't want it to serve that function. They want it to serve their function. And so now the move is well along that the governments of the world and finally the United Nations will control the internet, will determine what can be said, what cannot be said on the internet, who will have access to broadcast information on the internet. And so it's going to become a tool of totalitarianism instead of a break against totalitarianism.
I'll tell you, it's just always interesting to have conversations like this, because the one thing that always comes to mind is each generation replaces the one before it, and you think, wouldn't there ever be a break in that cycle? But it just seems to keep growing bigger and bigger, and you wonder, will it ever end? But there's always a possibility, and that always starts with being armed with the right information, and then knowing that what you do with that information does make a difference. Go ahead and give your website out again.
Yes, the one that I'm most interested in is the Freedom Force website, because that's where we hope to be able to make a difference. So that's www.freedomforceinternational.org, freedomforceinternational.org. And Daniel, if anybody's interested in the educational materials, our commercial site, where we actually sell books and videotapes and audio tapes, is entirely different, and that's called the Reality Zone. So that's realityzone.com, and we have about 100 different items there, and I think anybody interested in learning more on these topics will find more than enough.
Well, I do know, too, just to let our listeners know out there, that I wanted to get a hold of your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, so I usually like to go through the library. I've got a hold on it, but there are 7 other holds on that, so I figure that I might be seeing the book sometime in the next 2 years. But obviously there's interest in it. You know, people know about it. Yeah. And that's the first best start is just, again, people just knowing about this is always a good start. And then what they do with that information, of course, is what creates the difference. And it's been a real pleasure to have you on our program today.
Well, thanks a lot, Daniel. It's a pleasure being here.
You bet. And hopefully we'll be in touch in the future to see if there are changes to let people know that, hey, in fact, this is happening, this is beginning to make a difference, but it's up for you to rise and get involved as well.
Absolutely. Just being informed is not enough.
Okay. G. Edward Griffin, our guest, author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Again, thank you for being on our program today.
Thank you, and goodbye.
You bet. And I'll tell you, for you listeners out there, you know, it's all about getting involved, so you've got what you need, so go ahead and get started. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 Radio program. Be sure to visit our website at beyond50radio.com with the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter and pass it on to a friend. Great information there for you as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, live your day past halfway.